Hey, how are you today? We are in we are reading the book Who Needs a Superhero. We are in chapter 12. The Punisher versus Green Arrow. What is God like? And this is part 6. It's going to be a little bit longer, so you be sure to bear with me. It's a little bit longer pages than what we're used to, but we'll get through it. Okay, Green Arrow gets the title of this little section is The God Who's Ready for Anything. Green Arrow gets my vote as the best image of God in the comic book world. The adventurous archer offers a better way of thinking about God than does the avenging executioner. Oh, I know many fans consider Green Arrow a silly superhero. One longtime reader of comics said to me, someday someone with nothing better to do will write the history of the goofiest comic book heroes ever created, and Green Arrow will get his own chapter. DC Comics writers have revised Green Arrow over the years to make him more palatable. In the 1970s, Green Arrow became relevant. He confronted issues like racism, overpopulation, and pollution. Today's Green Arrow is a character both more serious and more realistic. At least as comic fans define realistic. There's scarcely a trick arrow in sight these days. I've enjoyed all the incarnations of this latter-day Robin Hood, but my heart belongs to the original version of Green Arrow, who made his first appearance in 1941. He and his sidekick Speedy rode around in the Arrowmobile or the Aeroplane and took on criminals using a bow and a variety of gimmicky arrows. Green Arrow and Speedy hung out for decades without becoming first stringers. Their adventures usually regulated to backup features. But those stories were great, fun to read, no matter what dilemma faced the Emerald Archer. He would always pull out of his quiver the right arrow for that occasion, I should say. For instance, if a crook were about to get lost in a crowd, Green Arrow would keep the felon in his sights with a heli-spotter arrow, a sort of hovering mirror affair. Fleeing getaway car was easily followed with the fountain pen arrow hooked to a bumper, leaving a trail of ink on the highway. A poison gas attack? No problem. Use the fan arrow to disperse the deadly fumes. Is a villain brandishing a lit stick of dynamite? The rain arrow will extinguish the fuse and save the day. The net arrow saw a lot of use, as did the boomerang arrow. Then there were flare arrows, dry ice arrows, firecracker arrows, the two-stage rocket arrow, the accelerating torch arrow, the aqua lung arrow, the rarely used but occasionally very helpful fake uranium arrow. A Green Arrow story never generated much suspense. You already knew that he was going to pull out just the right arrow for this moment of need. Never mind that the boxing glove arrow, as big as your head, and couldn't possibly fit in the quiver. Don't ponder the infinite number of arrows squeezed into that quiver. Never question how the Green Arrow could always lay his hand on the right shaft in a split second. Forget all that. The fun lay in discovering what outlandishly unexpected arrow was coming next. Unlikely as it may seem, God has a great deal in common with Green Arrow. As a matter of fact, in the The Old Testament writers often imagine God as a divine archer in the heavens aiming his arrows at earth. Sometimes God shoots arrows of vengeance and justice. God will bend and string his bow. He has prepared his deadly weapons. He makes ready his flaming arrows. Psalms chapter 7 verses 12 and 13. On other occasions, God brings forth the arrows of salvation, as in the passage where the Messiah speaks, "In the shadows of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver." Isaiah chapter 49 verse 2. This is not our usual way of thinking about God, even though the idea comes straight from the Bible. I'll bet you never heard a single sermon on God the archer. But if God is truly the heavenly bowman, then it must follow that God has a bottomless quiver equipped with precisely the right arrows for every occasion. Enter Green Arrow. Not only does God provide for us, but God apparently loves trick arrows. You never know what God is going to do next. Consider some of the off-the-wall ways in which God met Israel's needs in those wonderful Old Testament stories. For instance, there were frogs and boils and burning hail. There was the brass snake on the pole, the trick of the walking stick that turned into a snake, and the other walking stick that blossomed into fresh flowers. God saved Israel from the Armenians with sound effects in the dark, and God took care of the Mennonites with a destructive loaf of barley bread. Then there was the hornet attack, the soggy sheepskin, the ravens delivering groceries, the angry mother bear, the jar of oil that refused to run dry, and the sandals that never wore out. Oh, and let's not forget the talking donkey. On the whole, the two things that are consistently true in the Bible: one, God provides for the faithful, and two, God provides in unexpected ways, sometimes in ways that seem utterly inadequate at the moment. For example, remember when Israel was stymied at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in? God loosed the fan arrow, and a mighty wind blew all night long, and the Israelites had to be scratching their heads and asking, "What do we need with wind? We can't even get our tents set up. This is the help you're sending us, God?" But the next morning the Israelites discover the wind has driven back the sea and dried the path across the muddy seabed. To Israel's surprise, the fan arrow was exactly what they needed. Consider the time Israel was going into battle against the Canaanites in the Esdraelon Valley. Everything was riding on the battle. The Israelites had barely managed to hang on to their foothold in the Promised Land. In fact, they were hiding in the hills because that was the only place they found safe from the Canaanite chariots. Chariots were the cutting edge of military technology. The Canaanites had them, iron chariots, in fact, and Israel didn't. When God told the Israelites to go face the Canaanites in the valley, the Jews were understandably skeptical. The valley was broad and flat, a perfect battlefield for chariots. The battle began. The Israelites could not possibly survive the fight. The chariots were going to grind them into the ground. That's when God fired the rain arrow. The heavens started pouring. The Israelite soldiers were probably thinking, "Thanks so much, God. Not only must we fight a losing battle, but now we get to be wet and cold before we die." But the rain softened the ground, and the river Kishon overflowed its banks and flooded the plain. The valley floor turned into mud when the battle began. No one could guess what God was up to. But can you guess what happened? To those iron chariots in the soppy mud, Israel prevailed thanks to the rain arrow. A few generations later, the great threat was the Philistines, and again, it was a matter of technology. The Philistines knew how to work iron, the Israelites didn't. The Philistines' bronze weapons were utterly outclassed by the Philistines' armor. In an earlier chapter, I mentioned the Israelites' need, but I didn't explain the unlikely circumstances through which God provided for that need. At the same time, the Jewish king Saul was insane and insanely jealous of Israel's best general, a young man named David. Saul drove David from his court, chased him into the wilderness, hoping to kill him. David had actually had to take refuge among the Philistines, pretending to be a traitor to his own people. David was a man to trust God, but surely he wondered why God wasn't giving him the help in those dark days. He needn't have worried. David did eventually return to Israel. He became king, and suddenly the inventory of iron weapons in Israel grew like wildfire. Bible scholars believe that during the time among the Philistines, David spied out the secrets of working iron, which he brought back with him. Who could have dreamed that a murderous, paranoid king and a bitter exile in the camp of the enemy would provide the Israelites with precisely the skill they needed to face the Philistine threat? Who would have imagined it? God, of course. God obviously thought it through and carried it through. And that is the end of part 6. I hope you stay tuned for it all. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and come back for the end, part 7 of What is God Like? The Punisher versus Green Arrow of chapter 12. And remember to share and comment. Have a great and wonderful day.